The whiskey glass shattered against the saloon floor as Marshal James Thornton's hand froze mid-air. Across the dusty street of Silver Ridge, Montana, walking past the general store as casual as a Sunday morning, was a woman he'd buried 11 years ago. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sun the same way it had on their wedding day. Same delicate walk, same way of tilting her head when she examined the fabric in the merchant's window. But it couldn't be her. It couldn't be Catherine. Because Catherine had burned alive with their 2 children in a farmhouse fire outside Austin, Texas in 1869, while James had been away chasing the Dalton gang across 3 counties. He'd found their charred remains himself. He'd identified her wedding ring melted into the floorboards. He'd buried 3 coffins and spent the next decade drinking away the guilt that he wasn't there to save them. Yet here she stood, alive, calling herself by a different name as the shopkeeper greeted her with a friendly wave. James stumbled out of the rusty nail saloon, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. The woman turned slightly, and he saw her profile, the small scar above her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen from their porch swing. Every rational thought in his mind screamed impossible, but his eyes, even after years of whiskey and grief, couldn't be fooled. He'd memorized every curve of that face during 7 years of marriage. This wasn't someone who looked like Catherine. This was Catherine. The sun felt too bright, the air too thin. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with only her at the end of it. She carried a wicker basket, wore a green dress he'd never seen, and smiled at something the merchant said. She was real. She was solid. She was alive. And she had no idea her dead husband was watching her from across the street, his entire world crumbling into dust for the 2nd time in his life. James couldn't move. His boots felt nailed to the wooden boardwalk as he watched the woman, his Catherine, laugh at something the store owner said. The sound carried across the street, that same musical laugh that used to fill their farmhouse kitchen while she kneaded bread. His chest tightened until breathing became a conscious effort. Around him, Silver Ridge continued its daily rhythm. Horses clopped past. A wagon creaked by loaded with mining equipment. Children chased a hoop down the street. But James existed in a frozen moment, separated from the living world by a wall of impossibility. His mind raced through explanations, each more desperate than the last. A twin sister Catherine never mentioned. Impossible. She told him everything about her childhood in Philadelphia. About being an only child, about her parents dying of cholera when she was 16. A remarkable coincidence? He'd been a lawman for 20 years, and he knew the odds of 2 women sharing not just a face, but also that specific scar, that particular way of moving, that exact shade of auburn hair. Someone playing a cruel trick? Who would even know enough details to attempt such a thing? The fire had been ruled an accident. A lamp knocked over during a struggle when raiders hit their farm looking for the marshal's cash. At least, that's what the Texas Rangers had concluded. Catherine, or whoever she was, completed her purchase and stepped back onto the street. James watched her pause, pull a small notebook from her basket, and write something down. That gesture hit him like a physical blow. Catherine had kept lists for everything. Grocery lists, chore lists, lists of baby names they'd never gotten to use after Samuel and little Emma were born. She'd written in that same concentrated way, with her tongue slightly visible between her lips. James took a step forward, then stopped. What would he even say? "Excuse me, ma'am, but I buried you in 1869. The marshal's badge on his chest suddenly felt heavy as lead. He'd built his entire life around the certainty of her death. The grief had nearly destroyed him that first year. He'd resigned from the Austin Marshal's office, drifted north through territories and towns, taking temporary deputy positions, never staying long enough to form attachments. The guilt of surviving when his family hadn't had become the core of his identity. Now this woman, this impossible living ghost, was walking away from him down Main Street. James forced his legs to move, following at a distance. She turned down Copper Avenue, the residential street where the town's more prosperous citizens lived. He kept to the shadows, feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. What was he doing? Stalking a stranger based on a resemblance? But it wasn't just resemblance. It was recognition at a cellular level, the kind of knowing that bypassed logic entirely. She stopped at a well-maintained two-story house with blue shutters and a white picket fence. A brass nameplate by the door read, Mrs. Elizabeth Winters. Catherine's middle name had been Elizabeth. Was that coincidence too? She climbed the porch steps and a man appeared in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit. He kissed her cheek with familiar affection. James felt his hands curl into fists. The man called out something and two children ran onto the porch. A boy about 10, a girl perhaps 8. They hugged the woman's legs and she laughed, running her fingers through their hair. The girl looked up and James's knees nearly buckled. She had Catherine's eyes. His Catherine's eyes. Those same green-gold eyes that had looked at him with love across 1,000 mornings. The boy's hair was the exact shade of auburn that Samuel's had been. James backed into an alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Impossible. All of it impossible. Yet happening right before his eyes. That night, James sat alone in his rented room above the assayer's office. A bottle of whiskey untouched on the table before him. For 11 years, alcohol had been his escape, his way of blurring the sharp edges of memory. But tonight, he needed clarity. His mind kept circling back to that day in 1869, forcing himself to examine details he'd spent over a decade trying to forget. He'd been 3 days' ride from the farm, tracking the Dalton gang with a posse from 2 counties. They'd finally cornered the outlaws in a box canyon near the New Mexico border. The shootout lasted 4 hours. By the time they'd captured the survivors and collected the bodies, it was past midnight. James had been exhausted, hungry, but satisfied. The Daltons had robbed 6 banks and killed 2 peace officers. Justice had been served. He'd ridden home thinking about Catherine's smile when he walked through the door, about throwing Samuel up in the air until the boy squealed with laughter, about reading Emma her favorite story before bed. He'd smelled the smoke 5 miles out. Every lawman knew that smell, the particular char of burned wood mixed with something worse, something organic. He'd pushed his horse to a gallop, knowing, already knowing, but refusing to accept it until he saw. The farmhouse had been reduced to a blackened skeleton of timber and stone. The barn had somehow survived, the animals inside frantic but alive. Neighbors from 3 miles away were still there, faces soot-stained and grim. Old Tom Henderson, who'd helped James build the porch, could barely meet his eyes. "Raiders came through yesterday evening," Tom had said, his voice rough. "We saw the smoke, but by the time we got here..." He hadn't needed to finish. They'd found 3 bodies in what had been the bedroom. Burned beyond recognition, but identifiable by location and size. 1 adult female, 2 small children. The Texas Rangers had arrived the next day, investigated, taken statements. Lamp oil had been splattered around the bedroom. The raiders had locked them in and set the fire deliberately. A message to lawmen who got too aggressive chasing outlaws. At least that's what everyone assumed. But now, sitting in this Montana room with his world turned inside out, James remembered details that hadn't seemed important at the time. The bodies had been burned far worse than the surrounding structure suggested they should be. The Rangers had commented on it. Someone had dumped extra accelerant directly on the corpses, and the wedding ring they'd found, the one he'd identified as Catherine's, had been lying on top of the ashes, not buried in them as it should have been if she'd been wearing it when she burned. He'd been too destroyed by grief to question these inconsistencies. The Rangers had been satisfied with their theory. The case was closed. James pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. He'd carried it for 11 years, the edges worn soft as cloth from countless readings. Catherine's last letter, delivered by a neighbor the day before he'd left to chase the Daltons. He unfolded it carefully and read it again by lamplight. Her handwriting, neat and flowing, described ordinary things. Samuel had lost a tooth. Emma had learned to count to 20. The garden was doing well. She loved him. She'd see him soon. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest she was planning to… What? Fake her own death? Abandon him? Impossible. Catherine had loved him. He'd stake his life on that certainty. Unless he'd been wrong about everything. Morning light found James outside the Silver Ridge Public Records office the moment it opened. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, looked startled when the marshal loomed over his desk. "I need everything you have on Elizabeth Winters," James said, keeping his voice level despite the chaos in his chest. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "Mrs. Winters? She's one of our most respected citizens, Marshal. Is there some trouble?" "Just routine inquiries. The records?" 20 minutes later, James spread documents across a reading table, his hands shaking slightly as he traced through the paper trail of this woman's life. According to Silver Ridge records, Elizabeth Winters had arrived in Montana Territory in 1870, just months after the fire. She'd come from Ohio, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident. She'd purchased the house on Copper Avenue with inheritance money, established herself as a seamstress of exceptional skill, and married Richard Winters, a wealthy mine owner, in 1872. The children were listed as hers from her first marriage. Her maiden name was recorded as Elizabeth Fletcher. James copied every detail into his notebook. Birth date, April 15th, 1840. That would make her 40 years old now. Catherine had been born April 15th, 1840. Same day. He felt ice water in his veins. The coincidences were piling up beyond any reasonable explanation. He requested older records, anything from 1870 when she'd first arrived. The clerk returned with a thin folder. "Not much here, Marshal. Mrs. Winters, well, Mrs. Fletcher as she was then, kept to herself at first. Understandable, being a new widow and all. But there's the property deed, the business license for her seamstress shop, and a reference letter from a minister in Columbus, Ohio." James examined the reference letter. It praised Elizabeth Fletcher's Christian character, her dedication to her children after her husband's tragic death, her skill with a needle. It was signed by Reverend Thomas Albright of the First Presbyterian Church. Everything seemed legitimate. Too legitimate. Catherine had been Methodist, not Presbyterian. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, not Ohio. She'd never mentioned knowing anyone in Columbus. Yet the handwriting on the reference letter, when James compared it to immigration forms Elizabeth had signed, looked practiced and genuine. Someone had created an entire false identity, complete with documentation that would satisfy any cursory investigation. "Tell me about Richard Winters," James said to the clerk. "The husband." The young man's face brightened. "Oh, Mr. Winters is a pillar of the community, sir. Owns the Silver Queen mine, the largest operation in the valley. Came here in '68, made his fortune when they struck that big vein in '71. He's on the town council, funds the school, donated the church bell. Fine gentleman." "He married Elizabeth in 1872? "Yes, sir. Quite the event, actually. She'd been here about 2 years by then, built up a good reputation. Folks say Mr. Winters courted her for months before she agreed. He's 15 years older than her, but they seem happy enough. Those children of hers, though, they're not his by blood. She was already a widow with 2 little ones when they met." James felt his jaw tighten. Those children. He'd seen the girl's eyes, the boy's hair, but the timeline was wrong. If this was Catherine, if she'd somehow survived and fled to Montana, where had she gotten 2 children who looked so much like? The thought hit him like a fist to the gut. What if Samuel and Emma hadn't died in the fire either? James found the seamstress shop on 3rd Street, a neat establishment with lace curtains in the window, and a painted sign reading, "Mrs. Winters Fine Tailoring." He stood across the street for 10 minutes, watching through the glass as Elizabeth, his maybe Catherine, worked at a sewing machine. She was alone in the shop, her head bent over fabric, completely absorbed in her work. The afternoon sun lit her profile, and James felt 11 years of grief crystallize into something harder and angrier. If this was Catherine, if she'd let him believe his family was dead while she built a new life in Montana, then everything he'd suffered, every bottle he'd emptied, every sleepless night haunted by guilt that he hadn't been there to protect them, all of it had been based on a lie. But if this wasn't Catherine, if this was just some cruel cosmic joke, then he was losing his mind, seeing ghosts where only strangers existed. Either possibility felt unbearable. He crossed the street and pushed open the shop door. A small bell chimed. Elizabeth looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, James saw something flash across her face. Recognition? Fear? It vanished so quickly he might have imagined it. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly, setting down her work. "How may I help you today?" Her voice. God, her voice. The same slight Philadelphia accent she'd never quite lost. The same warm tone. James had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "I need a shirt mended," he managed, unbuttoning his vest to show a tear in his sleeve that he'd made with his knife that morning specifically for this excuse. "Of course." She stood moving toward him with professional grace. "I can have that ready for you by tomorrow evening. Shall I take your measurements to ensure the repair matches properly?" She was close now, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Lavender. Catherine had always worn lavender. Her hands reached for his arm, and when her fingers touched his shirt sleeve, James saw her freeze, just for a heartbeat, but he saw it. She'd felt it too, that electric recognition. Their eyes met, and James saw her pupils dilate. "Have we met before?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice steady despite his hammering heart. "You seem familiar." "I don't believe so, Marshal." She'd noticed his badge. "I'm sure I would remember meeting a peace officer. We don't get many lawmen in Silver Ridge. What brings you to our town?" "Tracking a fugitive. Man named Dalton escaped from a Texas prison last month. You ever been to Texas, Mrs. Winters?" Her hands had stilled on his sleeve. "No, Marshal. I'm from Ohio originally. I've never traveled south of Colorado." It was smoothly said, but James had interrogated enough liars to know the tells. The slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered to the door, the increase in her breathing rate. She was lying, and she knew he knew it. "That's interesting," James said softly, "because I could swear I knew you in Texas, long time ago, before you were Mrs. Winters." "You must be mistaken." Her voice remained level, but her hands had dropped from his arm. "I've never been to Texas, and I've never met you before today. Now, if you'll leave your shirt, I'll have it mended by tomorrow." "What about your children, Mrs. Winters? Were they born in Ohio too?" Now he saw the fear clearly. It darkened her eyes and tightened the corners of her mouth. "My children are none of your concern, Marshal. If you don't have actual business here, I'll have to ask you to leave." James leaned closer, close enough that his words would reach only her ears. "I buried my wife and children in 1869, Mrs. Winters, burned in a farmhouse fire outside Austin. My wife's name was Catherine Elizabeth Thornton, but maybe you knew that already." The color drained from her face. For a moment, James thought she might faint, but then her spine stiffened, and when she met his eyes again, there was something fierce and desperate in her expression. "Get out," she whispered. "Get out of my shop right now, or I'll scream for the sheriff. The sheriff works for me this month. I'm the territorial marshal, Catherine, and I want to know why you let me think you were dead. My name is Elizabeth Winters. I don't know who you think I am, but you're mistaken. Please leave." Her voice had risen enough that passers-by might hear. James stepped back, aware that causing a scene wouldn't help his cause, but as he moved toward the door, he spoke over his shoulder. "I know it's you, Catherine. I know our children are alive, and I'm going to find out why you did this, even if it takes me another 11 years. James spent the next 3 days watching the Winters house from various vantage points around Silver Ridge. He learned the family's routines with the methodical patience that had made him a successful lawman. Richard Winters left each morning at 7, riding a fine black horse to his mine office. The children, the boy and girl James couldn't bring himself to name, even in his thoughts, walked to school at 8:30. Elizabeth stayed home most mornings, working on sewing projects, and went to her shop on 3rd Street after lunch 3 days a week. On Thursday mornings, she volunteered at the church. On Sunday, the whole family attended services at the Silver Ridge Community Church. It was the most normal, respectable, impossibly ordinary life imaginable. Nothing about it suggested dark secrets or faked deaths. Several times, James questioned his own sanity. Maybe grief had finally broken something in his mind. Maybe he was seeing what he desperately wanted to see, creating elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting that his family really was gone. But then he'd catch a glimpse of the girl's profile, or hear the boy's laugh carry across the street, and every doubt would evaporate. Those were his children, older, changed, but his. On the fourth day, James waited until Richard Winters had left for work, and Elizabeth had departed for her volunteer duties at the church. Then he did something that would have horrified his younger, more principled self. He broke into their house. The back door lock was simple, meant more to keep honest people honest than to stop a determined intruder. He was inside within 30 seconds, standing in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. Evidence of family life surrounded him. Children's drawings on the wall, a slate with arithmetic problems written in chalk, a rag doll sitting on a chair. Each detail felt like a knife between his ribs. He moved through the house systematically, searching he wasn't sure for what. Evidence, proof, some explanation that would make sense of the impossible. The parlor was furnished with expensive taste. Mining money had been good to the Winters family. James found himself in what was clearly Richard's study. The desk contained business ledgers, correspondence about ore shipments, deeds, and contracts. Nothing unusual. He was about to leave when he noticed the locked drawer in the bottom right. It took him 2 minutes to pick it. Inside, he found a steel box. The box was locked too, more seriously this time. James hesitated. This was already a legal entry and search. Breaking into a locked box crossed another line entirely. But he'd crossed so many lines already. What was one more? He used his knife to pry the mechanism, and the box popped open. Inside were documents, the kind people kept when they needed insurance against some future threat. James spread them on the desk, his hands shaking. The first was a birth certificate for Samuel James Thornton, born March 3, 1863, in Austin, Texas. Parents, James and Catherine Thornton. The second was for Emma Catherine Thornton, born November 12, 1865. Same place, same parents. His children's actual birth certificates. He'd given the originals to Catherine to keep in her Bible. Why would Richard Winters have copies? Beneath those were other documents. A marriage certificate for James and Catherine Thornton, dated June 7, 1862. A property deed for their Austin farm. Medical records from when Samuel had broken his arm falling from a tree. And at the bottom, a letter in Catherine's handwriting, dated March 1870, addressed to someone named Michael Fletcher. James read it with growing horror. "Michael, I've done as you instructed. I've established myself in Silver Ridge under the name you provided. The children are safe and adapting to their new life. The Marshal believes we're dead. The fire was convincing enough. But I'm frightened every day that he'll discover the truth. I know you said this was necessary, that his work had put us in danger we couldn't escape any other way. But I see his face in my dreams. I see his grief. What we've done to him isn't just cruel, it's evil. But you promised me the alternative was worse. You promised me the Dalton gang would kill us all if we stayed. I'm trusting you were right. Please don't let me down. Please keep us safe like you swore you would. Catherine." James read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new pain. She'd faked her own death, faked their children's deaths, on purpose, because someone named Michael Fletcher had convinced her James's work as a lawman had made them targets. The Dalton gang. The same gang he'd been chasing when the fire happened. Not a message. Not retaliation. A lie. All of it a lie. Created to make him think his family was dead so they could disappear safely. James sat in Richard Winters' study, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal, trying to make sense of the timeline. Catherine's letter to Michael Fletcher was dated March 1870, 4 months after the fire, which meant she'd already been in Montana, already started her new life as Elizabeth Fletcher when she'd written it. The fire had been in November 1869. She'd moved fast, gotten documents, traveled over 1,000 miles with 2 small children, all while pregnant with grief's twin brother, Fear. But who was Michael Fletcher? The name itched at James's memory. He'd heard it before, somewhere in the context of the Dalton case. He pulled out his own notebook, the one he'd kept from those days, which he still carried because lawmen never really stopped working cases, not even cold ones from 11 years ago. He flipped through pages of testimony, witness statements, gang member profiles, and there, on a page dated October 1869, he found it. Michael Fletcher, suspected associate of Dalton gang, former Texas Ranger, dismissed 1867 for corruption charges, believed to be providing intelligence about martial movements and bank security to various outlaw groups. Warrant issued September 1869, never served. Subject disappeared, presumed fled to Mexico or California. James had written those notes himself, copying them from Ranger headquarters in Austin. He remembered the name now because it had angered him. A Ranger gone bad, using his badge to help criminals. But if Fletcher was a Dalton associate, why would he help Catherine fake her death to escape the gang? It made no sense unless... James felt his stomach drop. Unless Fletcher hadn't been protecting Catherine from the Daltons. Unless he'd been protecting the Daltons from James. Getting rid of a Marshal's family was one thing. But faking their deaths and convincing the Marshal to leave Texas entirely, to drift away from the territory where he'd been most effective against the gang, that was strategic genius. A grieving man who couldn't even stay in the state where his family died wasn't a threat to anyone. James's hands curled into fists, crumpling the letter. Catherine had been played. Fletcher had probably told her the Daltons were coming for them, that the only way to keep the children safe was to disappear, to make James think they were dead so he'd stop pursuing outlaws so aggressively. She'd believed him. She'd trusted him. And she'd destroyed James's life to save their children from a threat that might not have even existed. Or had Fletcher told Catherine the truth, and James just didn't want to admit his work had put his family in real danger? The thought made him sick. He'd been so dedicated to the law, so committed to bringing in criminals. Had he been blind to the risk he was forcing his wife and children to bear? The sound of a door opening downstairs froze him mid-thought. Footsteps in the kitchen, a woman's voice calling out. Elizabeth, Catherine, whoever she was now, had come home early. James rapidly gathered the documents, shoved them back in the steel box, and returned it to the locked drawer. No time to properly relock everything. He slipped out of the study and moved toward the back of the house, looking for another exit. "Samuel? Emma? Are you home early?" Catherine's voice drifted up the stairs. She was checking the children's rooms. James found a rear staircase, likely meant for servants, though this house didn't seem to have any, and descended quickly. He just reached the back door when he heard her footsteps above him, moving toward the study. How long until she noticed signs of intrusion? He slipped outside, carefully closed the door, and moved quickly through the back garden toward the alley. He'd made it halfway down the block when he heard the scream, high and terrified, cut short as if she'd clapped a hand over her own mouth. She'd found the broken lock. She knew someone had been in her house, in her husband's study. She knew someone was getting close to her secrets. James kept walking, keeping his pace normal. Just another man going about his business in Silver Ridge. But inside, his heart was racing. He'd shown his hand. Now she'd be frightened, defensive, maybe ready to run again. He needed to move faster. James needed leverage, something to force the truth into the open without alerting Catherine that he was closing in. That meant learning everything he could about Richard Winters, the man who'd married his wife and was raising his children. He started at the Silver Ridge assayer's office, where mining claims were registered and production reports filed. The clerk there, an older man named Pete Thornton, no relation, James had checked, was happy to talk about the town's most successful mine owner. "Richard Winters? Sure, I know him. Everyone does. Struck it rich in '71, the Silver Queen vein. Changed this town. That discovery did. Before that, Silver Ridge was barely more than a camp. Now we've got 3,000 people, a proper main street, even talk of the railroad coming through." Pete pulled out claim records, spreading them on the counter. He filed his first claims in '68, but didn't hit anything significant for 3 years. Persistent man. Some folks thought he was crazy, investing so much in what looked like played-out territory. James studied the documents. Richard Winters had filed claims for 17 different plots in 1868 and 69, a significant investment. Where'd his stake money come from? Takes capital to file that many claims. Pete shrugged. Never asked, but rumor was he came from money back east. Philadelphia, I think someone said. Old railroad family. Philadelphia. Catherine was from Philadelphia. He ever mentioned knowing people there? Maybe from before he came west? Not that I recall. Why the interest, Marshal? James deflected. Just background checking. His name came up in connection with something else. He tapped the 1868 filing date. This was before he married Mrs. Winters? Oh, years before. He was a bachelor until 72. Quite the catch, too. Half the unmarried women in the territory had their eye on him. Pete chuckled. But he only had eyes for Elizabeth Fletcher, the seamstress widow. Courted her proper and everything. Romantic, really. James left the assayer's office with more questions than answers. Was it coincidence that Richard Winters came from Philadelphia, the same city Catherine had grown up in? That he'd arrived in Montana Territory in 1868, the year before the fire? That he'd had enough money to file multiple mining claims despite apparently being new to prospecting? The pieces weren't fitting together right. This wasn't just the story of a widow meeting a wealthy mine owner. There were too many connections. Too many conveniences. He found the Silver Ridge Weekly Gazette office next, a small operation run by a printer named Douglas McIntyre. James spent 2 hours going through back issues from 1868 to 1872, reading every mention of Richard Winters. The first appearance was an arrival notice from June 1868. Mr. Richard Winters of Philadelphia has taken residence in Silver Ridge, with intent to pursue mining interests in the valley. Just 2 lines, unremarkable except for that city name again. The wedding announcement from April 1872 was more detailed. Mr. Richard Winters, proprietor of the Silver Queen Mine, was wed Saturday last to Mrs. Elizabeth Fletcher, widow of the late Martin Fletcher of Columbus, Ohio. The ceremony was held at Silver Ridge Community Church with Reverend Stevens officiating. The bride was attended by Mrs. Sarah Henderson, and Mr. James Blackwood stood up for the groom. Mr. and Mrs. Winters will reside at the Winters home on Copper Avenue. Mrs. B. Winters' children from her previous marriage, Samuel and Emma, will complete the happy family. Samuel and Emma, using their real names, either bold or careless. James photographed the announcement with his memory, every detail. But it was a society column piece from December 1871 that made him stop breathing. The upcoming marriage of Mr. Richard Winters and Mrs. Elizabeth Fletcher is much anticipated in Silver Ridge society. The couple has been keeping company for over a year since Mr. Winters returned from business in Philadelphia in September of 1870. Friends report Mr. Winters has been a devoted suitor and has formed a touching bond with Mrs. Fletcher's young children. September 1870. Richard Winters had been in Philadelphia, Catherine's home city, in September 1870, just months after Catherine had arrived in Montana and written that letter to Michael Fletcher. James felt the pieces starting to align, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. What if Richard Winters wasn't just a convenient husband Catherine had found after fleeing Texas? What if he'd been part of the plan from the beginning? James decided to force the issue. He waited until near midnight, when the respectable families of Copper Avenue had extinguished their lamps, and Silver Ridge slept under a canopy of stars. Then he climbed over the Winters' back fence and made his way to the house. Not breaking in this time. This time, he was going to knock on the door and demand the truth, consequences be damned. But he never got the chance. As he approached the back porch, he heard voices through an open window. Catherine's voice, pitched low but agitated, and a man's responding rumble that must be Richard Winters. James moved closer, pressing himself against the wall beneath the window. He knows Richard. I saw it in his eyes at the shop. He knows it's me. Catherine's voice was tight with fear. You don't know that. You said he didn't see you clearly. It was across the street. I know my husband. I know how he looks at me. And today someone broke into your study. The lock on the box was damaged. He found the documents. A long silence. Then Richard's voice, heavy with resignation. "Then we have to leave, tonight. Take the children and go, just like we planned if this ever happened." "Go where, Richard? How many times can we run? How many new names can we take?" "As many as it takes to keep you safe. To keep the children safe." James felt his jaw clench. Safe from what? From him? He was their father, not some threat to be fled from. Catherine's voice broke. "I'm so tired of lying, so tired of seeing his face in my dreams, watching him grieve, knowing what we did to him. Maybe it's time to tell him the truth. The truth will get you killed, Elizabeth." Richard used her false name deliberately. "Or have you forgotten what Fletcher told you? The Daltons have long memories. If they know you're alive, if they know you can identify the man who really ordered that hit..." "Fletcher was a liar." Catherine's voice rose, then dropped again quickly, aware of sleeping children upstairs. "He was a Dalton man himself. You said so. For all we know, he fabricated everything to get James out of Texas. He fabricated the death threats you received. The letter that came to your house with the detailed plans of how they'd burn you alive. The photographs of the children that someone left on your porch with the eyes cut out." Richard's voice hardened. "I saw those threats, Elizabeth. I was there in Philadelphia when Fletcher brought them to your father's estate. I saw you collapse when you realized what James's crusade against the Daltons had brought down on your family. Fletcher didn't lie about the danger. He might have been a criminal himself, but he was telling the truth about the gang wanting you dead." James staggered back from the window. Catherine had received death threats. Fletcher had taken evidence to Philadelphia. Richard had been there. None of this matched the story he'd built in his head. "My father paid Fletcher $20,000 to make us disappear," Catherine said quietly. $20,000 to stage a fire, to find us a place to hide, to create new identities. We bought our safety with blood money from a corrupt ranger. How is that something I'm supposed to feel good about? Your father saved your lives, and mine." Richard's voice softened. "I was the one who told your father about Fletcher, remember? I was working that Philadelphia bank job when I overheard Fletcher offering his services to another family in trouble with outlaws. I never expected to fall in love with you when I agreed to help escort you and the children to Montana. I certainly never expected you'd agree to marry me after everything." James heard Catherine sob once, then stifle it. "I love James so much, Richard. I still love him, God help me. But I love you too. You saved my children. You've been a father to them when their real father thought they were dead. How do I reconcile that? You don't. You just keep living one day at a time and pray that James never finds us. Pray that he stayed broken and drinking in some Texas town, that he never drifted north, that he never..." "Too late for prayers," James said, stepping into the lamplight pooling from the window. He'd heard enough. Both figures inside spun toward the window, Catherine's hand flying to her mouth. "I'm already here." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Richard Winters reached for something, probably a gun, but James was faster. He had his Colt drawn and pointed through the open window before the mine owner's hand reached his desk drawer. "Don't," James said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just want the truth. All of it. Starting with why my wife let me bury 3 empty coffins while she ran off to Montana with a Philadelphia banker." Catherine's face was white as chalk in the lamplight. "James," she whispered. "Oh God, James. Suppose you invite me in," James said, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand near it. "We've got 11 years of conversation to catch up on." They sat in the Winters parlor like civilized people having tea, except the tea was whiskey, and the civilized veneer was thin enough to shatter at the slightest pressure. Catherine sat beside Richard on the settee, her hand clutching his like a lifeline. James took the chair across from them, every inch of distance between him and his wife feeling like a mile of broken glass. "Start from the beginning," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "And don't leave anything out." Catherine took a shaky breath. "It started 6 months before the fire. A letter came to the house addressed to me. No signature, just a message. 'Tell your husband to stop hunting the Daltons. or we'll make you watch your children burn." I thought it was just intimidation at first. Outlaws trying to scare the marshal's wife. I didn't even tell you because I knew you'd either dismiss it or become overprotective, and I didn't want either. James felt his chest tighten. She'd been threatened and hadn't told him. Go on. Then more letters came, detailed letters describing what they'd do to Samuel and Emma. They knew their names, James. They knew Samuel's favorite toy was his wooden horse. They knew Emma was afraid of the dark. They'd been watching our house, watching our children. Then the photographs started arriving. Her voice broke. Someone had followed Samuel to school and taken a photograph of him. They cut out his eyes with a knife and left it on our porch. The same with Emma. I found them when you were away on that week-long pursuit in August. Why didn't you tell me? James heard the anger in his own voice and tried to control it. I was your husband. I could have protected you. Could you? Catherine met his eyes, and hers were full of pain and accusation. You were gone 3 weeks out of every 4, chasing one gang or another. You'd made enemies, James. Powerful enemies who didn't care about laws or badges or innocent children. The Daltons weren't just outlaws. They had connections, resources, people in places we'd never suspect. How exactly were you going to protect us when you were 200 miles away tracking them? James had no answer to that. She was right, and the knowledge burned like acid. Richard Winters spoke for the first time since James had come inside. I was working as a financial consultant in Philadelphia when Catherine's father contacted me. Edmund Harrington, one of the wealthiest men in the city. He'd heard through his business network that his daughter in Texas was in danger. He wanted to hire protection, but he knew regular guards wouldn't be enough against the Dalton gang. That's when he found out about Michael Fletcher. The corrupt ranger, James said bitterly. Corrupt, yes, but also connected. Fletcher knew the gang's operations, their safe houses, their plans. He was the one who warned us that the Daltons had put a price on Catherine's head. $20,000 to whoever could make the Marshal's family disappear. Dead or alive, didn't matter. The message was what counted. Stop hunting us, or everyone you love dies. Catherine continued, her voice steadier now. Fletcher came to see me in September of 1869. You were chasing the gang toward New Mexico. He showed me evidence. Letters from gang members, plans they'd written down, dates they'd targeted for the attack. Everything pointed to them coming for us the first week of November. He said I had 2 choices. I could tell you, and you could try to protect us while still doing your job, which would likely get all of us killed. Or I could disappear with the children, make it look like we'd died, and give you a reason to leave Texas entirely. No more Marshal hunting the Daltons. No more threat to their operations. Everyone wins. Everyone except me, James said harshly. I spent 11 years thinking I'd failed you. Thinking I should have been there, drinking myself stupid trying to forget the smell of burned bodies that turned out not to be you at all. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. I know. God, James, I know what we did to you. But Fletcher convinced me it was the only way to keep Samuel and Emma alive. He said the Daltons would kill them first, make you watch, then kill you last. He described it in such detail, such horrible detail. I couldn't risk it, I couldn't risk our babies. So you burned 3 bodies in our farmhouse and ran. James's voice was flat, emotionless, because emotion would break him apart. 3 prisoners from the county jail, Richard said quietly. Fletcher arranged it. They were scheduled to hang anyway. He drugged them, transported them to your farm, and set the fire with them already dead. The bodies were too burned to identify beyond basic size and sex. The Rangers never questioned it because why would they? A Marshal's family killed in retaliation for his work against the gang. It was a story that made sense. James put his head in his hands. And you just left, both of you. Took my children and started a new life like I didn't exist. They remember you. James looked up sharply at Catherine's words. What? Samuel and Emma. They remember you, James. Samuel was 6 when we left. Emma was almost 4. We didn't erase you from their lives. We couldn't have even if we'd tried. Samuel asks about you constantly. He remembers you teaching him to ride. Remembers the stories you'd tell about being a lawman. Emma remembers less, but she remembers your voice, the way you'd sing to her before bed. The words hit James like physical blows. You told them I was dead too? No. Catherine shook her head firmly. Never. We told them their father was a hero who couldn't be with them because bad men were hunting our family. We told them you thought we were gone, that you believed we'd died, and that keeping that secret was the only way to keep everyone safe. We told them that maybe someday when the danger had passed, we might be able to see you again. Does the danger still exist? James asked. After 11 years, are the Daltons still a threat? Richard and Catherine exchanged a glance. We don't know, Richard admitted. The gang was broken up years ago. Most of them are dead or imprisoned, but some escaped, disappeared into Mexico or the territories. Fletcher sent word in '75 that the contract on Catherine might still be active. After that, we heard nothing. He vanished, probably killed by the gang when they found out he'd helped her escape. James stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street. His mind was reeling, trying to process everything he'd learned. His wife was alive, his children were alive. They remembered him. But they'd been living a lie for 11 years, and he'd been living in hell. Could he forgive that? Should he? I want to see them, he said without turning around. Samuel and Emma, I want to see my children. James, Catherine started to protest. I'm not asking permission, Catherine. I'm telling you. Tomorrow morning before they go to school, I'm coming back here and you're going to let me see them. You owe me that much. You owe me 11 years worth of mornings I should have spent watching them grow up. Silence filled the room. Then Richard spoke quietly. You're right. You deserve that. But you need to understand something, Marshal. Those children upstairs, they know me as their father now. I've raised them. I've been there for scraped knees and bad dreams and school problems. I've taught Samuel to ride and Emma to read. I love them as much as any father could love his children. I'm not trying to take your place because I know I never could. But I'm not stepping aside either. Those kids need stability, not upheaval. James turned to face him. Are you asking me to just walk away? Pretend I never found them? I'm asking you to think about what's best for Samuel and Emma, not what's best for your grief. Richard stood, meeting James's eyes steadily. They're happy, Marshal. They're safe. They have a good life here. You coming back into it, revealing the truth, exposing them to potential danger from whatever's left of the Dalton network, is that really what a father does? Or is that what a man does who's thinking about his own pain? The words were calculated to hurt, and they succeeded. James felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. But beneath the rage was the terrible suspicion that Richard Winters might be right. I need air, James said roughly. He headed for the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. I'll be back at sunrise. Have them awake and ready to meet me. After that, we'll figure out what happens next. He walked out into the night without looking back. James didn't sleep that night. He sat in his rented room, watching the darkness slowly give way to gray dawn, wrestling with the hardest decision of his life. Every instinct screamed at him to reclaim his family, to take Samuel and Emma away from the people who'd stolen them, to rebuild the life that had been ripped away from him. But Richard's words kept echoing in his mind. What was best for his children versus what would ease his own suffering? Were those the same thing? He thought about Samuel at 6 years old, holding his hand while they walked to town, asking endless questions about everything they passed. Samuel at 10, learning to become a man under Richard Winters' guidance, probably more stable and secure than he would have been with a grieving, drinking father. He thought about Emma at 3, barely more than a baby, curling up in his lap while he read to her. Emma at 8, with no real memory of him at all, calling another man father without confusion or guilt. Was he being selfish to want them back, or was he being a coward to consider walking away? At sunrise, James walked to the Winters house. Catherine answered the door, her face pale and exhausted. She'd clearly not slept either. They're in the sitting room, she said quietly. I told them someone important wanted to meet them. someone from our past. But James, please, be careful what you say. They're just children." He nodded and followed her inside. The sitting room was bright with morning light, and there they were, Samuel and Emma sitting side by side on the sofa, looking nervous and curious. Samuel had grown tall, with James's build and Catherine's coloring. Emma was delicate and auburn-haired, her green-gold eyes watching James with careful attention. They were beautiful. They were alive. They were strangers. "Children," Catherine said gently. "This is Marshal James Thornton. He's someone your father and I knew a long time ago, before we came to Silver Ridge." Samuel stood, offering his hand with the formal politeness Richard had clearly taught him. "Pleased to meet you, sir." James took the boy's hand, feeling his throat close up. This was his son who didn't know him, who was being polite to him like he was any adult stranger. "Pleased to meet you too, Samuel. Your mother's told me a lot about you." Emma stayed seated, studying James with those familiar eyes. "Mama says you knew us when we were little, in Texas." "That's right, I knew you both very well. But we don't remember you," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Were you important?" The innocent question nearly broke him. I'd like to think so. I cared about you very much." Samuel was still watching him with keen interest. "You're a marshal. Did you work with our real father?" "Mama said our real father was a lawman too." James looked at Catherine, who had tears streaming silently down her face. She gave him the slightest nod. Permission, or perhaps surrender. He turned back to Samuel. "Yes, I worked with your father. We were very close. In fact, that's why I'm here. I have messages from him. Things he wanted you to know in case—" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "In case you ever wondered about him." "What kind of things?" Emma had moved to the edge of her seat, interested now. "Well, he wanted you to know that he thinks about you every single day, that he's proud of you, even though he can't be with you. He wanted you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing he ever had to do, and he only did it because he thought it would keep you safe." James's voice was rough with emotion. "He wanted you to know that if things were different, if the world was fair, he'd give anything to be your father properly, to teach you things and watch you grow up and be there when you needed him." Samuel's eyes had grown very bright. "How do you know all that? How do you know what our father thinks?" James met the boy's gaze steadily. "Because I know him better than anyone else in the world, Samuel. Trust me on that." For 3 days, James visited the Winters' house each morning, spending an hour with Samuel and Emma before they went to school. He told them stories about their real father, carefully crafted tales that were true, but maintained the fiction that James was just a messenger. Samuel was sharp, though, asking increasingly pointed questions about how James knew so many specific details. Emma, younger and more open, simply enjoyed the attention, treating James like a favorite uncle who told good stories. On the 4th morning, everything changed. James was walking toward the Winters' house when he noticed 2 men loitering near the corner of Copper Avenue. Something about them immediately triggered his lawman instincts. They were trying to look casual but watching the Winters' house too intently. Both wore trail-worn clothes and had the hard-eyed look of men who'd lived outside the law. James altered his course, approaching them from an angle that kept his badge visible. "Morning, gentlemen. You fellows lost? Can I help you find something?" The taller one, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, sized James up. "Just admiring the nice houses, Marshal. No law against that, is there?" "Depends on why you're admiring them. You boys new to Silver Ridge?" "Just passing through. Heard there might be work at the mines." It was smoothly said, but James didn't believe a word. These weren't miners. These were hunters, and he had a terrible suspicion about what they were hunting. "Where you from originally?" "Texas, way back. Been drifting north the last few years." The man's eyes flicked to the Winters' house again just for a second, but James caught it. His blood turned to ice. "Texas. Whereabouts?" "Austin area, mostly. You know it?" "I used to work there, long time ago." James kept his voice casual, but his hand had drifted closer to his gun. What did you say your name was? Didn't, but it's Cole. Jesse Cole. This here's my partner, Tom Reed. Jesse Cole. The name rang a bell from old wanted posters. Minor associate of the Dalton gang, never caught. Assumed dead or in Mexico. James felt his pulse quicken. Well, Mr. Cole, Mr. Reed, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. We don't take kindly to strangers loitering around residential areas in Silver Ridge. Cole's expression hardened slightly. That's so? Even when those strangers might have business with the residents? What business would that be? The kind that's between us and them. Private-like. James stepped closer, letting his hand rest on his gun butt. See, here's the thing. I'm the territorial marshal, which means everything that happens in Silver Ridge is my business, especially when it involves men with Dalton connections showing up in my town. Both men tensed. Cole's hand moved toward his belt, and James drew his Colt in a smooth motion, having it pointed at Cole's chest before the outlaw could complete his move. Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. My reflexes are a lot faster than yours, and I haven't had coffee yet, which makes me irritable. We ain't done nothing illegal, Marshal, Reed said nervously. He was younger, maybe 25, and clearly less experienced than his partner. Not yet, but I know who you are, Cole. I've been tracking Dalton Associates for over a decade. You were part of the gang back in '69, part of the crew that hit banks across Texas. You disappeared after the gang broke up, but you're still wanted on 3 counts of armed robbery. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly why you're watching that house, and then you're going to get on your horses and ride out of Montana. If I ever see you in this territory again, I'll shoot you on sight. Are we clear? Cole's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to know when he was beaten. Fine. We got word that someone we've been looking for might be living here. Someone who owes a debt to our old organization. We were just checking if the tip was solid. What debt to who? Can't say. But the bounty's still active after all these years. $20,000, same as it always was. James felt his stomach drop. $20,000 for who? Cole smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. The woman who testified against our operations. The one who gave federal marshals details about our banking connections and safe houses. The one whose husband… He stopped, his eyes widening as realization hit. Wait, you said you worked in Austin. You said you tracked Dalton Associates. What did you say your name was? I didn't. But it's Thornton. Marshal James Thornton. And that woman you're hunting? She's my wife. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. James saw the calculation in Cole's eyes, weighing odds, considering options. Then Cole made his choice. His hand darted for his gun, and James fired. The shot caught Cole in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the street. Reed froze, hands raised, eyes wide with panic. Don't move, James barked. Don't even breathe wrong. He kept his Colt trained on Reed while checking Cole's wound. Not fatal, but the man wouldn't be using that arm for a while. People were emerging from houses now, drawn by the gunshot. James saw Richard Winters running from his house, Catherine right behind him. James! Catherine's voice was high with fear. What happened? Get inside, James commanded. Both of you, get the children and get inside now. Lock the doors. He didn't take his eyes off the 2 outlaws. These are Dalton men. They know you're here. Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed Catherine and pulled her back toward the house. James heard her protesting, but Richard was stronger and more focused on immediate safety. The local sheriff arrived moments later, a deputy in tow, both with guns drawn. James quickly explained the situation while keeping his weapon on Reed. Get them locked up. Cole needs a doctor, but he's under arrest for attempted murder of a territorial marshal. Reed's wanted on robbery charges. I'll file the proper paperwork later, but right now, I need to secure a witness. James was already moving toward the Winters house before the sheriff could respond. Inside, he found chaos. Catherine was crying, holding both children close. Samuel looked terrified but was trying to be brave. Emma was openly sobbing. Richard stood by the window with a rifle watching the street. The comfortable, safe life they'd built was crumbling around them. How many more? Richard demanded. How many more Dalton men know she's here? I don't know. Cole said they got a tip. Someone told them where to look. James holstered his gun and approached Catherine carefully. "We need to know who gave them information. Who knew you were here besides us?" Catherine shook her head. "No one. We were so careful. Only Fletcher knew, and he's been dead for years." "Are you sure he's dead? Did anyone verify it?" She looked up, eyes red. "Your father sent word in '75 that Fletcher had been found dead in Mexico. Shot by someone, probably gang members who figured out he'd helped us." "My father?" James felt something cold settle in his chest. "What does my father have to do with this?" "He was helping Edmund," Richard said quietly. "Your father and Catherine's father were friends from the war. When Edmund needed help arranging Catherine's escape, he reached out to your father. Marshal Thomas Thornton was the one who put us in contact with Fletcher. He helped coordinate the whole thing." James staggered back as if he'd been punched. His father. His own father had helped fake Catherine's death and never told him. Had watched him drink himself into ruin. Had seen his grief and had said nothing. He knew. All these years he knew you were alive, and he never told me. "He was trying to protect us," Catherine said desperately. "All of us, including you. James, the Daltons put a price on your head too. You just never knew it because your father buried the information. They wanted you dead as much as they wanted us dead. Your father thought if you believed we were gone, if you left Texas, you'd be safe. We'd all be safe. Well, we're not safe now." James forced his emotions down, focused on the immediate problem. "Those two outside aren't working alone. If they found you, others can too. We need a plan." Samuel, who'd been silent through all of this, suddenly spoke up. His voice was small but steady. "Are you really our father?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the boy. Samuel was staring at James with recognition dawning in his eyes. "I've been thinking about it. All the stories you told, the way you know things about us, the way Mama looks at you. You're him, aren't you? You're our real father." James looked at Catherine, who nodded slightly through her tears. He turned back to his son and, for the first time in 11 years, told the truth. "Yes, Samuel, I'm your father. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before. I'm sorry for everything." Emma pulled away from Catherine, staring at James with wide eyes. "But Mama said our father thought we were dead." She said, "I know what she said, sweetheart. And until a few days ago, I did think you were dead. Finding out you're alive, finding your mother alive, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. But it's also brought danger back to you, and that's something I have to fix." "How?" Richard asked bluntly. "You can't arrest every Dalton associate in the West." "No, but I can end this once and for all. I can make sure no one ever comes hunting my family again." James met Richard's eyes. "I need to know where Fletcher got his information. If he's really dead, someone else has taken over his network. Someone's still coordinating these bounties, still keeping track of old grudges. I need to find out who and shut them down permanently." "That could take months, years even," Richard protested. "Then it takes that long. But I'm not walking away, not anymore. My children deserve to live without fear, and I'm going to make that happen." James looked at Samuel and Emma. "I promise you both you're going to be safe. Your real father is going to fix this." 3 months later, James Thornton sat in the Silver Ridge Telegraph office, reading the confirmation he'd been waiting for. The last of the Dalton network had been dismantled. Federal marshals in 3 territories had made simultaneous raids based on information James had gathered. 12 arrests, 3 shootouts, and most importantly, the ledger books from the gang's financial operations, including the complete list of outstanding bounties and the names of everyone who'd placed them. Catherine's name had been crossed off the list, marked contract void, with a date from 1876. The supposed tip that had brought Cole and Reed to Silver Ridge hadn't come from the gang at all. It had come from a rival bounty hunter trying to collect on old information, acting alone, without gang backing. The threat had been a ghost, kept alive by fear and paranoia more than reality. The Daltons themselves were gone, broken, scattered to the winds. The price on Catherine's head had been canceled years ago, but no one had bothered to tell her. She'd been running from shadows. James walked back to the Winters house where an unusual family had formed over the past months. Catherine still lived there with Richard, and James had taken a room at the boarding house down the street. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was honest. Catherine had made her choice 11 years ago, and while James understood it better now, understanding didn't erase the years between them. She loved Richard. Richard loved her and the children. And James, well, James was learning to be a father again, without trying to reclaim a husband's place that belonged to another man. Samuel met him at the door, excited as always. "Did you hear back? Is it really over?" "It's really over, son. The threat's gone. Your mother's safe. You're all safe." The boy whooped and ran inside, shouting the news. Emma appeared a moment later, more reserved but with a smile that lit her entire face. "Does this mean you're staying in Silver Ridge?" "If your mother and Richard don't mind, I've been offered the permanent marshal position here. Seems the territorial governor was impressed with my work dismantling the Dalton network." Emma threw her arms around his waist and James felt tears prick his eyes. 3 months ago, she'd been afraid of him. Now she hugged him like he'd been there her whole life. Maybe that's what healing looked like. Slow, imperfect, but real. Inside, Catherine and Richard were waiting. The awkwardness between the 3 adults had eased somewhat, replaced by mutual respect and the shared goal of raising 2 children who needed them all. It would never be conventional, but it was theirs. "So it's done?" Catherine asked quietly. "It's done. You can stop being Elizabeth Winters if you want. You can be Catherine again." She smiled sadly. "I think I'm both now. Elizabeth is who I've been for 11 years. That's not fake just because Catherine was real first. I've earned this name, this life. I understand." And James did. People changed. Grief and fear and necessity reshaped them into something new. The Catherine he'd married in 1862 didn't exist anymore. Neither did the James who'd been her husband. They were different people now, connected by history and children and a love that had transformed into something else. Something smaller, perhaps, but more honest. Richard extended his hand. "Thank you, Marshal, for everything, for understanding, for not tearing this family apart when you could have." James shook his hand, surprising himself by meaning it. "Thank you for protecting them when I couldn't, for being the father my children needed. That matters more than my pride." That evening, James read to Samuel and Emma before bed, a new tradition they'd established. The children sat on either side of him, one child who remembered him vaguely, and one who was building new memories. When they finally fell asleep, James stood in the doorway watching them breathe, still marveling at the impossible truth that they were alive. He'd come to Silver Ridge hunting ghosts and found something better than resurrection. He'd found forgiveness. For Catherine, for his father who'd died 2 years ago never telling him the truth, for Richard who'd been a better man than James wanted to admit, and finally, for himself. For all the times he hadn't been there, for all the ways he'd failed, for all the years he'd spent drowning in guilt over deaths that never happened. The old James Thornton had died in that fire in 1869, just as surely as if the bodies in the ashes had been real. The man he'd become in the 11 years since was someone different, someone harder, lonelier, but maybe someone stronger too. Strong enough to accept that happy endings didn't always look like he'd imagined. Strong enough to be grateful for what he had instead of mourning what he'd lost. As he walked back to his boarding house under the Montana stars, James thought about the twisted road that had brought him here. A fire that wasn't what it seemed. A wife who'd died and lived again. Children who'd been ghosts and became real. And a truth that had taken 11 years to surface, painful and necessary, and ultimately liberating. His family was safe. His children knew their father. The debts of the past were paid. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd seen Catherine walking down that street 3 months ago, but it was an ending he could live with. And sometimes, that was enough. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed this tale of loss, redemption, and the complicated nature of family, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who appreciate deep Western dramas. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought about James's journey and whether you think he made the right choice. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Until next time, may your own trails lead you home, no matter how long the journey takes.